Elias Rourke knew something was wrong with the morning, long before he opened the cabin door. The air inside already felt tighter, heavier, as if the storm outside were pressing its weight against the walls. He stood beside his small stove, hand hovering over the iron, listening to the way the wind wrapped itself around the logs and pushed at the roof. Only then did he lift the latch, crack the door, and see what the valley was waking up to. Dawn didn't so much arrive in the Rockies as quietly thinned the darkness, revealing only faint, shifting shapes beneath a storm intent on swallowing everything in sight. The wind moved like a living force, slamming against the mountainsides, snapping pine branches with violent cracks, and ripping loose white drifts from the high ridgeline. Snow piled against cabin walls until windows vanished completely, buried under layers of moving, breathing cold. In weather like this, heat didn't rise the way people believed. It escaped, as if it were trying to flee. Inside most of the valley's homes, the air turned so sharp it stung the lungs with every breath. Chimneys struggled under the storm's pressure, drafts forced their way through any crack wide enough to accept them, and bitter cold crept across floors in slow, deliberate waves, testing the strength of every beam and every nail. Storms like this punished carelessness, exposed every shortcut, and reminded settlers just how fragile their shelters really were. And yet, Elias Rourke's cabin stayed warm. Before the season began, he had carved a narrow split straight along the ridge of his roof, a strange-looking gap the neighbors swore would be the death of him. They warned that no one survived the Rockies by cutting holes into their shelter. They mocked the idea that a man could fight winter by letting the sky in. "You're letting the warmth escape," they told him. "That crack will bury you before the season ends." But when the whiteouts of 1879 descended, something unexpected happened. While their chimneys choked, his roof breathed. While frost gathered thick along their rafters, his remained dry. While their hearths roared desperately against the wind, his fire burned with a quiet, steady confidence, as if untouched by the violence outside. A structure with a hole in its roof should have surrendered to the storm. Instead, his cabin remained 34 degrees warmer than any home around it. Why? And how did a simple, ridgeline gap, doubted, mocked, dismissed, become one of the frontier's most misunderstood survival designs? Winter came early that year, and the valley still talks about it with the kind of reverence reserved for disasters that leave scars on memory. The blizzard of 1879 didn't roll down from the peaks like an ordinary storm. It fell on the land as if the sky itself had collapsed. Temperatures plunged faster than anyone could recall. Barometers crashed. Herds vanished into the timber so abruptly it felt like an omen. Old-timers said the clouds looked bruised, swollen with a cold that pressed against the world more like weight than temperature. By nightfall, the wind was carrying shards of ice so fine they sliced across exposed skin like powdered glass. Every family braced behind their cabin walls, but no one truly believed those walls were ready for what was coming. As the whiteout deepened, the storm began exposing weaknesses frontier builders rarely admitted to. Snow slammed against the unified ridgelines of most cabins and formed a hard, frozen seal, a lid that trapped smoke inside instead of letting it escape. Rafters sagged under the weight of drifts that grew heavier by the minute. Icicles began forming inside homes, clinging to rafters where warm breath met air that had turned brutally cold. Chimneys coughed black smoke into rooms as the downdrafts overpowered them. Embers no longer rose in tidy curls but whipped sideways, robbed of the upward draw a fire needed to burn clean. Ironically, the tighter a cabin was sealed, the faster it failed. By all logic, one shelter should have been the first to collapse. The mountain man's cabin was not built with thick-hewn logs or heavy insulation, nor was it engineered with any of the clever reinforcements the others swore by. His fire was small, fed only by split pine, and a careful bed of coals he tended without fuss. And then there was the element that had made him the valley's quiet joke. A narrow, continuous gap carved along the entire length of his roof ridge. Neighbors had called it a flaw, a wound, proof he didn't know how to build. In a place where warmth meant survival, who cut a line straight through their own shelter. Before the storm, the mockery had been lighthearted. One man joked he could see daylight through the fool's roof. Another said wolves wouldn't need to break in, the cold would do it for them. But as the blizzard reached its peak, that good-natured laughter fell apart. Cabins went dim as smoke filled them. Men fought to keep their fires from suffocating. Doors froze shut, windows cracked from the pressure. And through the blinding white, some swore they saw a steady, unwavering glow of firelight slipping upward from the mountain man's ridge gap. A sight that should have been impossible, yet was unmistakably real. Sometime after midnight, when the wind screamed hard enough to rattle nails from their homes, he realized something extraordinary was happening. His cabin remained warm, warm enough that frost didn't form along the walls, warm enough that he couldn't see his breath. When he raised his lantern and inspected the strange opening, he watched the smoke rise through it in calm, undisturbed streams. The blizzard above wasn't forcing the cold inside. Instead, the snow was gathering around the gap in a perfect self-forming insulation layer. The roof wasn't losing heat at all. It was breathing. When the neighbors finally fought their way to his cabin the next morning, wrapped in frozen scarves and moving through the drifts like ghosts, they expected to find ruin. Instead, they opened the door and were struck by a wave of warm, stable air. Their own homes had fallen toward single digits. His interior, impossibly, hovered just above freezing, a 34-degree miracle on a night built to kill. Standing beneath that strange split-ridge roof, shivering from their own bitter night, they could only ask the one question that matched what they'd just seen. How did a hole in the roof save your life? Frontier cabins looked solid from a distance, with their thick logs, heavy rafters, and seams tightly packed with mud and moss. To the settlers who built them, this tightness was the entire point. A sealed cabin, they believed, was a warm cabin, a barrier against the vicious cold that swept through the Rockies every winter. But what looked strong on the surface often hid structural weaknesses waiting to be revealed by the first major blizzard. The very features that were meant to keep warmth inside could betray the builders the moment a storm tested them at full force. The greatest flaw lay in the single-ridge roof, the traditional design used in nearly every frontier cabin. In calm weather, it seemed perfectly reliable. One long beam running the entire length of the structure, supporting the roof like a sturdy spine. But during a heavy snowstorm, that spine turned into the trigger for a dangerous failure. Snow and wind packed themselves against the ridge, forming a dense seal across the roof's peak. Instead of shedding snow, the cabin became capped, like someone had pressed a lid onto a boiling pot. Once that lid formed, pressure built beneath it, forcing heat downward and stressing the rafters in ways the builders never anticipated. Settlers thought the ridge beam held their cabins together. In a blizzard, it acted more like a cork jammed into a bottle. Under that kind of snowfall, the sealed ridge created a suction effect no one understood at the time. As wind raced across the top of the cabin, it produced negative pressure inside, a vacuum that pulled air up, sideways, and backward. Suddenly, every tiny imperfection in the walls became an entry point. Cold air rushed in through chinking cracks, knot holes, window frames, and even the smallest gaps around the door. Fires struggled to keep up. Even the houses built with the most painstaking care weren't immune. The storm was effectively turning each cabin into its own draft machine, drawing freezing air inward faster than the hearth could drive warmth outward. Ironically, the more settlers sealed their homes, the more violently the wind forced itself inside when the weather turned. Chimneys, which were supposed to be the heart of a warm cabin, became some of the most dangerous features during whiteout conditions. When wind slammed into a sealed ridge, it reversed the chimney draft, pushing smoke downward instead of letting it escape. Flames bent sideways, embers skittered across the hearthstones in bursts of red. Thick smoke curled into rooms, turning the air unbreathable. As frost accumulated inside the flue, airflow slowed even more, trapping heat and poison gases together. Many fires simply died, smothered by the very pressure the cabins were designed to resist. At the root of all these failures was one belief the frontier settlers held with absolute conviction, that every opening meant heat loss. To them, any gap, any vent, any slit, any soft seam was a threat to survival. They imagined the Rockies as a place where warmth had to be hoarded, locked inside behind airtight walls. But the frontier didn't follow the logic of modern insulation. A cabin sealed too tightly couldn't breathe. One without proper ventilation burned fuel inefficiently. And a shelter with no controlled escape for warm air created the worst drafts of all, drawing cold into places it had no business entering. Their fear of losing heat blinded them to the reality that warmth sometimes depended on movement, on allowing air to cycle gently through the structure instead of trapping it. Inside these tight cabins, the consequences multiplied. Moisture from breath and cooking condensed on cold surfaces, freezing into thin layers of ice along the rafters. The added weight chilled the interior further. Fires, starved of oxygen, burned weakly or sputtered out entirely. Door frames contracted and jammed. Temperatures swung wildly every time the wind shifted direction, dropping from merely uncomfortable to dangerously cold within minutes. Settlers cursed their luck, blaming wicked winds or ill-tempered storms, never realizing the deeper flaw lay in the architecture they trusted so completely. And this is where the contrast begins to sharpen. While frontier cabins sealed themselves under pressure, the mountain man's split-ridge roof did the opposite. It never trapped snow in a rigid cap. It never built up suction. It never suffocated the space beneath it. Instead, his narrow ridge gap released pressure the moment it formed, stabilized the smoke flow inside, prevented drafts from tearing through the walls, and allowed warm air to escape in a slow, controlled rhythm rather than in sudden, violent bursts. Everything the settlers feared, gaps, vents, breathing structures, was exactly what made his cabin stronger. While others fought the storm with brute force and sealed walls, his roof worked with it. Elias Rourke wasn't born a builder. He became one the long, slow way, through storms, solitude, and the hard lessons only the wilderness can teach. Long before he ever raised a cabin in the Rockies, he moved through the backcountry as a trapper, drifting between wind-carved basins, timberline valleys, and forests still charred from old lightning strikes. Winters became his teachers. Nights spent inside crude lean-tos that groaned under snow weight taught him which mistakes killed quickly. Days spent studying how wind curled around ridges, how embers behaved in tight spaces, and how heat escaped through the smallest openings showed him that survival on the frontier didn't come from theory. It came from observation, paid for with frostbite scars and close calls. It was the snow itself that finally revealed a principle nobody else seemed to notice. In burned-out stumps and split rock, in the hidden hollows under fallen spruce trunks, he began recognizing a pattern. Snow didn't always smother warmth. Sometimes it preserved it. He found hollow logs where drifting snow sealed a crack but left a warm pocket beneath. He found wolf dens tucked under overhangs where snow piled over the entrance, yet warm air escaped quietly through hair-thin vents. These small discoveries fascinated him. Snow acted less like a blanket and more like a breathing skin, blocking wind, shaping airflow, and trapping heat while still allowing smoke and moisture to slip out. Nature wasn't insulating in spite of gaps. It was insulating because of them. One winter on the plains nearly killed him and cemented the lesson. He had built a shelter the way most settlers believed was correct. Tight, thick-walled, stuffed with hides, moss, and every scrap of material that could stop a draft. By nightfall, the fire was suffocating. Smoke crawled along the ceiling in sluggish waves. Frost formed on the rafters. The air thickened with moisture from his own breath, turning the small space into a freezing fog. The tighter he sealed the shelter, the more hostile it became. Crawling out into the storm saved him, and the bitter cold outside felt safer than the airless trap he had built inside. That night taught him the frontier's most counterintuitive law. A shelter without airflow is a coffin. He never forgot it. Years later, after watching smoke drift lazily through a cracked stump without extinguishing the glowing embers beneath it, inspiration struck. He took a piece of bark and carved the roughest of diagrams. 2 roof halves, a narrow vent between them, snow drifting over the top, forming its own natural, breathable seal. It was the simplest idea he had ever sketched, yet it felt radical. A roof that would intentionally let heat rise. A shelter that relied on slow, controlled loss to create greater stability. A structure that imitated wolf dens, stump hollows, and the caves shaped by winter winds. When Elias returned to the nearest settlement and began cutting notches for his roof beams, word spread quickly. Curious settlers gathered to watch him leave a deliberate opening at the ridge. They shook their heads, joked among themselves, and slapped frost from their mittens as they muttered insults. Heat leak, fool's vent, storm will rip that roof clean off. To them, he wasn't building a cabin. He was writing the first lines of a cautionary tale. But he didn't argue. He had seen too many men freeze to death because they trusted tradition more than the land itself. His guiding philosophy was brutally simple. Nature showed the pattern, and he merely built around it. When the blizzard finally arrived, that philosophy, quiet, patient, and shaped by years of observation, would face its greatest test. And before long, it would prove itself in a way none of his neighbors could have imagined. Most settlers saw snow as a threat, something that gathered on a roof only to crush it under its weight. But Elias Rourke understood something they didn't. Fresh snow is mostly air, a light, fluffy material that slows heat transfer better than any layer of chinking or scraps of hide ever could. As the blizzard deepened, snow drifted across the narrow opening at the roof ridge and settled into a soft, arched layer. It didn't seal the gap shut the way the neighbors imagined. Instead, it formed a breathable cap, almost identical to the natural formations he had studied years earlier in stump hollows and wolf dens. This snow blanket allowed warm air to rise gently through hairline openings while blocking the wind from punching directly into the living space below. While settlers scrambled onto roofs to shovel snow away, terrified of collapse, he let the storm complete the final step of his design. Wind behaved differently over his roof as well. On a traditional cabin, a continuous ridge acts like a wall. Wind slams into it, turbulence forms behind it, and the entire structure trembles under the shifting pressure. But when gusts swept across his split ridge, the flow of air dipped into the opening and then accelerated upward, creating a natural tunnel effect. This redirection reduced the uplift forces that normally tried to peel roof shingles straight off the rafters. Instead of fighting the wind, his roof guided it. Even during the worst gusts, the snow that remained on his roof served as ballast, and the open ridge prevented the violent pressure waves that rattled and warped the neighboring cabins. Pressure inside the structure told the same story. Frontier cabins all suffered from the stack effect. the tendency for warm air to rise too quickly and drag cold air through every gap near the floor. The stronger the fire, the stronger the suction. A sealed cabin was like a vacuum pump, pulling freezing air inside faster than the hearth could push warmth out. But the split ridge transformed that equation entirely. Instead of slamming into a sealed roof and forcing warm air downward, the rising heat drifted out through the narrow opening in a slow, predictable stream. That gentle escape stabilized the pressure inside the room, eliminating the sudden drafts that stole heat from families huddled near their hearths. His cabin breathed at its own pace, not in violent shocks but in a steady rhythm, almost like a forge that kept itself balanced. Smoke, too, behaved in a way the valley had never seen. During whiteouts, chimneys were notoriously unreliable. High winds forced themselves into the chimney mouth, reversed the draft, and sent smoke billowing sideways into living spaces. Flames bent, embers scattered, some fires even died, but the split ridge gap avoided all of these failures. It wasn't tall enough for the wind to force a direct reversal, nor wide enough for gusts to punch their way into the room. Snow partially shielded the opening, turning it into a gentle one-way vent. Warm smoke drifted upward through the snow arch as quietly as steam rising through a thatched medieval roof. Even at the height of the storm, the smoke line stayed thin and steady, the first visual sign that his strange idea was not a mistake at all, but a working system. The interior climate reflected that stability. While most frontier cabins swung wildly between hot and freezing, 20 degrees warmer near the rafters and 20 degrees colder near the floor, his remained calm. The ridge gap and the snow arch above it created a slow circular flow of warm air. Heat pooled near the peak, rolled down the walls, then lifted back up the center in a gentle cycle. Clothing dried faster. The fire burned more cleanly. Frost almost never formed on the timbers, and most importantly, the human body needed far less energy to stay comfortable. The true paradox was that his cabin didn't lose heat the way settlers feared it would. They assumed any opening meant warmth pouring out in a rush. But heat loss depends on two things: temperature difference and air movement. Most cabins bled heat not because they lacked insulation, but because uncontrolled drafts ripped warmth away faster than any fire could replace it. His structure lost heat upward, yes, but only as a slow, steady trickle. That trickle was the key. It prevented the violent pressure drops that dragged cold air in. It prevented chimney reversals. It prevented the sudden cold surges that froze other settlers in their sleep. In the end, it wasn't insulation that kept him alive. It was stability, and the split ridge roof delivered stability better than any tight cabin ever built in that valley. When the whiteout of 1879 reached its most violent peak, the valley fell into a cold so intense it split axe handles and froze ink solid inside inkwells. Most settlers woke in the darkness to find frost gathering on their blankets, creeping across their breath, and forming crystals along the edges of their beds. Fires died without warning. Rooms dropped toward deadly temperatures in minutes. And yet, in the middle of this catastrophe, one cabin behaved in a way no one could explain. The warmth inside did fall, but not suddenly. Not dangerously. It settled gently, landing at a temperature stable enough for bare hands to still work and warm enough that breath never showed in the air. To the neighbors, this was impossible. They asked themselves the same question again and again. How could a cabin with a visible slit in the roof hold heat better than cabins sealed so tightly they creaked under their own rigidity? The answer began long before the storm actually hit. In the days leading up to the blizzard, Elias Rourke's cabin had stabilized around the mid-40s to low 50s Fahrenheit. Maintained not by roaring flames but by a modest bed of coals and rounds of pine that burned slowly and evenly. Because the split ridge eliminated the violent suction drafts that plagued other cabins, the heat inside his home never escaped in chaotic bursts. Warmth stayed evenly distributed, soaking into the walls, the floor planks, the bedding, and every tool leaning against the rafters. So when the storm began to claw heat outward, he wasn't starting from cold. The entire structure held a reservoir of stored thermal mass, bleeding warmth back into the room at the exact moment it mattered most. Meanwhile, his neighbors were sealing every crack they could find, believing airtight homes were the key to survival. In reality, those perfectly sealed cabins were their own undoing. Their fires pulled air upward with such force that the buildings essentially turned into vacuum chambers. Cold air rushed inward through every flaw a builder couldn't see: the gaps under doors, the looseness in window frames, the imperfections in chinking, the tiny notches between logs. Their cabins inhaled the blizzard at ground level. His did not. Because warm air had a controlled exit through the ridge gap, the pressure inside remained balanced. Cold air had no reason, no incentive at all to force its way in. As a result, his floors stayed dramatically warmer than anyone else's. As the storm intensified, snow piled deeper across the roof, including over the split ridge. But instead of sealing the opening into a plugged, suffocating channel, the snow formed a porous arch, a dome made of countless trapped air pockets. That snow dome acted as insulation, slowing the escape of heat while still allowing smoke and moisture to drift upward and out. The worse the storm became, the thicker and more effective the insulating layer grew. The harder the wind blew, the more tightly the snow packed itself into a curved shield that wrapped the gap like a natural engineering solution. While neighbors stood outside in the shrieking dark, scraping the very insulation off their roofs out of fear, the storm quietly improved his. Inside, fire, air, and snow fell into a perfect rhythm. His fire remained low and controlled, ideal for the split ridge. High flames would have blasted heat straight through the opening. But a bed of embers created a warm reservoir that rose gradually, met the snow arch, and then rolled back down through the room in a calm cycle. Three elements worked together like parts of a single machine. The fire fed the air stabilized beneath the snow, and the snow shaped the flow back toward the fire. This loop created an interior climate that didn't soar into highs or crash into lows. It simply held, steady, predictable, protective. Across the valley, other cabins weren't so lucky. Steep roofs shed heat too quickly. Tall chimneys became wind funnels that suffered the worst backdrafts. Cabins sealed the tightest experienced the most violent pressure swings. Larger structures cooled rapidly because of their greater air volume, and every one of these weaknesses intensified during the storm. The mountain man's home, on the other hand, embodied everything the settlers considered wrong. A lower roof, thinner walls, a laughably small fire, and that ridiculous central gap they mocked for months. Yet his cabin stayed 34 degrees warmer than the average home in the area. The settlers with the tallest chimneys were the first to watch their fires sputter out. The families who sealed their windows the tightest suffered the fastest temperature collapses. In the aftermath, the paradox became impossible to ignore. Every settler believed survival depended on trapping heat inside a perfectly sealed structure. But what actually kept a cabin warm was preventing cold from crashing inward. Their homes were fortresses, rigid, airtight, and inflexible, and the storm punished every inch of them. His home was a lung, breathing with a quiet, controlled rhythm. By allowing warm air to escape gently through the ridge, he avoided the violent drafts that stole heat in seconds. A slow, steady loss was infinitely safer than a sudden plunge, and that principle, more than the fire, the walls, or the insulation, explained the astonishing 34-degree difference. Firecraft was the quiet discipline that made his entire roof system possible. His cabin didn't stay warm simply because of a clever architectural trick. It stayed warm because Elias Rourke tended the fire with a patience and precision most settlers never learned. He never shoved frantic bursts of wood into the stove or allowed sudden flare-ups to roar toward the rafters. Instead, he built his fires the way a trapper sets a snare. Slow, deliberate, predictable. Thick, quarter-split rounds of pine smoldered for hours, releasing steady heat without drama. The real engine of his warmth was the bed of coals, deep red and alive, glowing like a slow pulse beneath the iron. A roaring blaze would have blasted heat straight through the ridge gap and destabilized the delicate snow arch above the cabin. But coals lifted the temperature gently, allowing the snow dome to settle, harden, and become the self-balancing cap he depended on. His discipline kept the entire system in balance long before the storm arrived. Inside the cabin, he arranged his life according to the heat curve he discovered simply by living with the split-ridge design. In most frontier homes, the warmest space hugged the hearth, while the coldest air pooled near doors and windows. But his unique airflow created something else entirely. Heat rose through the center, slipped downward along the walls, and gathered in a quiet pool near the floor. Instead of fighting this pattern, he adapted to it. He placed his bed along the interior wall opposite the prevailing wind, where warmth descended evenly. He stored dry goods directly beneath the ridge gap, inside the soft circle of warmth that collected near the center of the room. Tools, boots, and anything that needed drying were placed where the descending warm air met the coldest corners, ensuring nothing froze overnight. His cabin became a miniature weather system, and he organized his daily life to move with its rhythms rather than resist them. Even his kindling strategy reflected that same instinct. While most settlers dried their fire-starting materials beside the hearth or stacked them against the chimney, he used the rising column of warm air itself. Between the two halves of the split ridge, he built a narrow shelf lined with twigs, curls of pine, birch bark, and thumb-sized sticks. The constant upward warmth from the coals below carried just enough heat to dry the wood without scorching it. By morning, even in sub-zero conditions, his kindling lit with a single spark. And because his fire never died completely, the drying continued even through the night, creating a natural cycle of fuel renewal that most cabins could never match. His approach to sealing the cabin followed the same logic. He didn't plug every crack the way other settlers preached. He sealed strategically. The lower logs were packed thick with wool, moss, and clay, recognizing that cold air always pushed inward from the ground line. Higher up, the chinking was intentionally looser, giving warm air a place to slip upward without building pressure. He hung hide curtains over window frames to soften cross-drafts, and he allowed snow to pile along the base of the walls, turning each drift into a natural earth berm. Every decision he made served a single idea: block uncontrolled drafts but allow controlled escape. In the violent pressure shifts of the blizzard, that balance became the difference between stability and collapse. Unlike the neighbors who spent their days chopping wood in frantic attempts to outrun the cold, his entire philosophy centered on stability over effort. He never tried to overwhelm winter with brute force. He shaped its forces so they worked for him. His roof didn't try to overpower the storm, it redirected it. His fire didn't rage, it persisted. His ceiling wasn't airtight, it was intelligent. And because he treated his cabin as a living system rather than a wooden box, he avoided the exhausting heat-draining routines that left other settlers freezing and spent. In the end, his survival wasn't the result of a single invention, but of the harmony between design and habit. Without disciplined firecraft, the gap would have wasted heat. Without strategic sealing, the pressure inside would have collapsed inward. Without snow berms, the drafts would have sliced across the floor. Without the kindling drying overhead, his fire might not have survived a long night. Every piece depended on the next. Together they formed a single survival machine, one man's quiet, practiced coordination of wood, snow, fire, and airflow. That harmony kept him alive when the storm tried to take everything. Frontier culture had a way of shutting down anything that looked unfamiliar. Out on the edge of settled land, strange ideas didn't earn curiosity, they earned suspicion. Lives depended on routines that had worked last winter, or the winter before that, and most families trusted what had kept their parents alive more than anything a wandering trapper might suggest. A roof with a deliberate gap carved down the center looked like pure madness to them. You built the way your father built, or the way your neighbor built, because anything else felt like inviting trouble. And so Elias Rourke's split-ridge roof became a perfect example of the frontier's stubborn pattern. An idea could be brilliant, but if it looked foolish, people refused to try it. Most cabins were built far too quickly for innovation to stand a chance. Many families arrived just weeks before the first frost, scrambling to raise a shelter before snow swallowed the valley. Their homes weren't crafted, they were thrown together in days from whatever logs they could fell and whatever mud they could scrape into the cracks. Unpeeled timbers, single-ridge roofs, rushed chinking, and hasty corners became the norm. Under such pressure, no one had time to experiment with something as unusual as an intentional gap in the roof. A design like that demanded careful shaping of the rafters, precise spacing, and most importantly, confidence in a theory rather than tradition. And on a frontier where one mistake could mean death, that kind of confidence was almost non-existent. To the settlers, appearance mattered more than physics. They judged roofs by what they looked like, not by how they managed airflow. A ridge gap looked like a flaw, a heat leak waiting to happen, a snow entry point just begging to collapse, a structural weakness that no sensible builder would risk. Some even joked it looked like he'd made a chimney out of the entire roof. But the truth ran in the opposite direction. Snow sealed the top naturally, the airflow reduced drafts, and the controlled venting prevented the dangerous pressure collapses that plagued sealed cabins in storms. Yet no explanation could overcome the gut-level instinct that a hole in the roof was reckless. Perception killed innovation long before evidence had a chance to save it. Cultural expectations around chimneys made matters worse. By the 1800s, settlers carried a deeply rooted belief that a proper home needed a chimney rising proudly from the roofline. A chimney meant order, civility, and permanence. Proof that a family had settled, not drifted. Anything else, even if it worked better, looked primitive or improvised, like the temporary shelters of trappers, wanderers, or people passing through. His split-ridge roof challenged centuries of identity tied to hearth, chimney, and the image of a respectable home. Few settlers were willing to build something that looked so different from what they believed a cabin should be. And even if someone did consider his idea, the design demanded attention rather than brute construction. A split-ridge roof wasn't something you built once and walked away from. It required a quiet partnership between the builder and the environment, clearing the gap after storms, keeping the opening narrow, shaping snow berms around the base, balancing firecraft with airflow, and maintaining selective chinking that changed with the seasons. Most settlers wanted heavier logs, thicker walls, and bigger chimneys, blunt, muscular solutions that required effort but not observation. His design rewarded patience, not force. And on the frontier, muscle was much easier to trust. By the time proof finally arrived, the moment had already slipped away. After the Great Blizzard, people came to his cabin with their scarves still frozen to their faces. They felt the warmth. They noticed the lack of drafts. They watched the smoke rise cleanly through the snow-capped opening. Some even muttered that they might rebuild the following summer. But the frontier was already changing. Lumber mills were arriving. Brickyards were opening. Railroads brought standardized homestead plans and factory-cut timber. Innovation gave way to prefabrication and uniform building methods. The age of one-man shelters, personal, experimental, hand-carved from lived experience, faded just as this little trick finally proved itself. In the end, the split-ridge roof survived not as a building method, but as a memory. A brief flash of frontier ingenuity that appeared, worked brilliantly, and then disappeared before the world was ready to understand it. Modern construction likes to believe it has outgrown the mistakes of the frontier, but in many ways it has simply hidden those mistakes behind better materials. We wrap our homes in insulation, vapor barriers, sealants, membranes, and tape until the entire structure becomes nearly airtight. On paper, that airtightness seems efficient. In reality, a home sealed too tightly behaves very much like the frontier cabins that failed during the 1879 blizzard. When extreme cold or strong winds arrive, the same old vulnerabilities reappear. Negative pressure pulling drafts through microscopic gaps, moisture trapped inside walls where it condenses into hidden ice, smoke backing up when downdrafts overpower the chimney, and sudden cold surges entering through openings too small for the eye to detect. Inside such a home, temperature swings often feel harsher than whatever is happening outside. We counter these problems with fans, thermostats, heat exchangers, and mechanical vents, machines performing tasks that older, simpler shelters once managed naturally. What we've lost is the old art of controlled ventilation. Early frontier cabins didn't try to be airtight. They tried to be balanced. They allowed heat to rise in a predictable column, drafts to settle where they caused the least harm, and moisture to escape without flooding the room with icy air. The mountain man's split-ridge roof was a masterclass in this balance. It wasn't built to trap heat. It was built to let heat move in a smooth, stable rhythm. Modern off-grid builders often rediscover this by accident. A small crack at the top of a yurt, a vent flap lifting inside a canvas tent, or a narrow opening in a log lean-to. Each one reveals the same principle he learned decades earlier. Stability depends not on sealing air in, but on guiding air as it moves. His split ridge wasn't a flaw, it was a pressure valve. Even snow, one of nature's most misunderstood materials, played a role modern builders rarely appreciate. Today we think of snow on a roof as weight, risk, and the precursor to collapse. But on the frontier, snow was part of the insulation system. The split-ridge design funneled rising warmth to the roof peak, where storms laid down snow in exactly the right place, directly above the warm air column. As the blizzard intensified, that snow thickened, sealed out drafts, trapped radiant heat, and formed a surprisingly effective thermal barrier. Modern survivalists often shovel snow off their shelters without realizing they are removing the very insulation nature provides for free. The reason older designs succeeded where modern sealed structures fail is simple. They worked with nature's rhythms instead of trying to overpower them. The split-ridge roof didn't fight wind patterns. It cooperated with them. It guided air instead of resisting it. It welcomed snowdrift patterns instead of battling them. It allowed radiant heat to rise naturally rather than trapping it beneath an artificial lid. Modern building culture, by contrast, tends to rely on plastic barriers, rigid engineering, and the assumption that storms will behave predictably. But on the frontier, predictability was a myth. Adaptation was the only rule that mattered. And though largely forgotten, his concept still has practical value today. Controlled ridge venting works remarkably well in off-grid mountain cabins, bushcraft shelters, expedition base camps, wood-heated tiny homes, winter survival structures, emergency snow shelters, and sub-zero homesteads. Field tests show that passive pressure management stabilizes temperature more effectively than many ultramodern camping structures sealed tight against the cold. What he discovered through years of observation now echoes in the principles behind Scandinavian timber cabins, Siberian winter huts, and Arctic snow houses. His final insight still echoes across time. Warmth isn't something you trap, it's something you guide. His shelter stayed warm not because it hoarded heat, but because it allowed heat to organize itself inside the space. It remained stable because it prevented cold from being sucked inward. It thrived because it turned wind, snow, and pressure into allies rather than threats. That's the lesson modern builders have forgotten. We try to overpower nature. He chose to listen to it and then build accordingly. In the end, his split-ridge roof was never just a clever improvisation. It stood as a quiet reminder of what the frontier demanded from anyone hoping to survive even a single winter. He didn't build it out of pride, or stubbornness, or a need to prove the neighbors wrong. He carved that narrow gap into his roof because storms in the high Rockies don't answer to opinions. They don't care about tradition, or confidence, or the comfortable belief that last year's methods will work again. They respond only to physics, to pressure, to wind, to snow, and he had spent enough lonely years wandering basins and timberline valleys to read those forces the way other men read scripture. While the rest of the valley chased thicker walls, heavier roofs, and ever tighter ceiling, he studied the one thing they never thought to question: how heat actually moves, how wind pulls, how snow behaves when it drifts, melts, or buries a structure piece by piece. That quiet, almost instinctive understanding, shaped by long nights in makeshift shelters and mornings watching storms sculpt the land, became the difference between a roof that panicked under stress and a roof that stayed warm through a 10-day whiteout. That, more than any tool or material, is what frontier survival truly required. Not brute force, but humility. Not insulation alone, but intuition. Not a battle against the land, but a willingness to listen to it. The people who survived weren't the ones who clung to tradition. They were the ones who adapted. And so the question passes to the viewer. Would you have trusted that narrow ridge gap? Or would you have laughed at it the way everyone else did? And which part of his design changed your sense of what actually keeps a shelter warm? Out here, the wind is always the final judge. Only those who listened survived.